Hi guys, I am Dionah Mae B Comillas of BSED-English 3A, and today we are going to talk about Still on the Chinese Literature, a continuation on the introduction to China. On the aspect of religion, China has a lot of religious worshippers, which is estimated at over 100 million, most of whom follow Buddhism. Other major religions are Taoism, Islam, and Christianity in both its Catholic and Protestant forms. The languages used by the Chinese people are Standard Chinese or Mandarin, Yue, Wu, Minbei, Minnan, Shang, Gang, and Hakka dialects, as well as minority languages. And in 1958, the First National People's Congress approved at its fifth session the adoption of the Pinyin scheme for the Chinese phonetic alphabet for spelling Chinese names and places in Roman letters. But the Pinyin system was not popularly used until the late 1970s. Pinyin is now widely seen in China, and it replaces earlier romanization spelling systems. On health, China provides wide access to primary health care and child immunizations. Average life expectancy was 71.8 years in 2002, having risen from 35 years on the eve of liberation in 1949. China's economy has boomed since 1978 and as a result of sweeping economic reforms. GNP grew from $128 billion in 1980 to $745 billion in 1998. China's economy continues to grow rapidly with a GDP real growth rate of 9.1% in 2003 and an annual industrial production growth rate of 11.6% between 1979 and 2000. After the founding of the PRC, 4 constitutions have been formulated successively in 1954, 1975, 1978, and 1982. The first constitution was adopted by the first session of the First National People's Congress, the chief legislative branch, on September 20, 1954. The present constitution was promulgated in 1982 and amended several times thereafter, in 1988, 1993, and 1999. The Communist Party of China, or CPC, is the country's sole political party in power. Hu Jintao became General Secretary of the CPC as its 16th National Congress in November 2002. Founded in July 1921, the CPC today has more than 66 million members and over 3.5 million basic organizations. Besides the CPC, there are 8 political parties. Aside from that, China is made up of 23 provinces, 5 autonomous regions, 4 municipalities directly under the central government, and the special administrative regions of Hong Kong and Macau. The 23 provinces are Anhui, Fujian, Gansu, Guangdong, Guizhou, Hainan, Hebei, Heilongjiang, Henan, Hubei, Hunan, Gansu, Jiangxi, Jilin, Liaoning, Qinghai, Shaanxi, Shaanxi, Sichuan, Taiwan, Yunnan, Zhejiang. The 5 autonomous regions are Guangxi, Inner Mongolia, Ningxia, Xinjiang, and Tibet. The 4 municipalities are Beijing, Chongqing, Shanghai, and Tianjin. The currency in China is renminbi or yuan. Finally, in the aspect of military, the People's Liberation Army or PLA includes the Army, Navy, Air Force, and the 2nd Artillery Force. Jiang Zemin is the chairman of the Central Military Commission of China, the country's top military organ and commander of its armed forces. Now moving on to the history of Chinese literature. Writing in China dates back to the hieroglyphs that were used in the Shang dynasty of 1700 to 1050 BC. Chinese literature is a vast subject that spans thousands of years. One of the interesting things about Chinese literature is that Much of the series literature was composed using a formal written language that is called Classical Chinese. The best literature of Yuan Dynasty era and the four novels that are considered the greatest classics are important exceptions. However, even during the Qing dynasty of 200 years ago, most writers composed in a literary stream that extended back about 2,400 years. They studied very ancient writings in more or less the original written language. This large breadth of time, with so many writers living in the various eras and countries, makes Chinese literature complex. Chinese literary works include fiction, philosophical and religious works, poetry, and scientific writings. The dynastic eras frame the history of Chinese literature and are examined one by one. The grammar of the written classical language is different than the spoken languages of the past 2,000 years. This written language was used by people of many different ethnic groups and countries during the Zhou, Qin, and Han eras, spanning 1050 BC to 220 AD. After the Han Dynasty, the written language evolved as the spoken languages changed, but most writers still based their compositions on classical Chinese. However, this written language wasn't the vernacular language even 2,000 years ago. The empires and groups of kingdoms of all these eras were composed of people speaking many different native languages. If Europe had a literary history like China's, it would be as if most European writers until the 20th century always tried to write in ancient classical Greek that became a dead language more than 2 millennia ago. Let us begin with Shang Dynasty, which was about 1700 to 1050 BC. The first dynasty for which there is historical record and archaeological evidence is the Shang Dynasty. It was a small empire in northern central China. No documents from that country survive, but there are archaeological finds of hieroglyphic writing on bronze wares and oracle boats. The hieroglyphic writing system later evolved into ideographic and partly phonetic Chinese characters. Next is Zhou Dynasty, which was about 1045 to 255 BC. The Zhou Dynasty was contemporaneous with the Shang Dynasty, and then they conquered the Shang Dynasty. Their dynasty lasted for about 800 years, but for most of the time, their original territory was broken up into dozens of competing kingdoms, and these finally coalesced into several big and warring kingdoms by the end of the Zhou era. The great literary works of philosophy and religion that became the basis of Chinese religious and social belief system from what is called the Spring and Autumn period, 770 to 476, and Warring States period. Taoism, Confucian literature, and other prominent religious and philosophical schools all emerged during these two periods. In Chinese history, the dominant rulers generally squelched or discouraged philosophical expression that contradict their own. So when there were several small powers, different schools of thought could survive in the land at the same time. The major literary achievements of the Confucian classics, early Taoist writings, and other important prose works originated in the late Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period of the Zhou Dynasty era. These literary works deeply shaped Chinese philosophy and religion. Confucius is said to have edited a history of the Spring and Autumn period called the Spring and the Autumn Annals that shapes Chinese thinking about its history. There were hundreds of philosophers and writers who wrote conflicting documents, and there was discussion and communication. That ends my report. To hear some of the details on the preceding dynasties, let us listen to the next reporters. Thank you for watching. Bye!